Hello, everyone. A very good evening to you if you are anywhere in Africa, and good morning, good afternoon to the rest of you joining us from across the world. We're very excited to have you join us in the third session of this edition of Rhetorics Education Certification course. Um, I'd like to say thank you to those of you who have been consistently turning up for the past 2 days, and also even those of you who have been joining by watching the recorded versions that we try to upload. I think you guys are also the reason why we try to get them out as soon as possible because we do understand your concerns with time zone differences and all of that. But thank you very much for joining. I think the last session was a true indication of the fact that even though we feel like maybe the adjudication market is saturated because a lot of who are doing IA gigs every weekend. I think yesterday testament to the fact that a lot of people do have adjudication phobia, even though they would like to, be able to adjudicate debating as well. When we had the session in 2020 or the first edition in 2020, it was easy to understand that we had a lot of new people. But even 2 years later, I'm still happy that there are a couple more persons who are new, but who are also very interested in learning, the art of adjudication. So we're very excited to have you, and we hope that you have fun today. Okay, so let's get into the business of the day. Our trainer today is I would say a very special person, largely because she's not just a guest on ACC. She's more or less, if ACC was an entity, I would also think that she's a founder as well. But I think that she's who shares the space for poor adjudication and the audacity people with district education actually at tournament. So she's one of the people who also thought, well, something needs to be done to ensure or to salvage the adjudication space and invariably then salvage, the debating space in itself because when we get education wrong, then a lot of people are going to leave debating tournaments feeling very dissatisfied, and that can hurt the way we engage with the sport in itself. Um, we have today a member of the core education panel of this year's World University Debating Championship. Um, I'm just going to give a very brief overview of her. Her name is Noluthando Honono. She's a debater, adjudicator, and a debate coach. Sorry, the way I pronounce her name is the way she pronounces when she's in her element. As a speaker, she has broken at several tournaments, including but not limited to Southern African National University Debate Championships, as well as the PAUDC. She won the 2019 Pretoria Parley Invitational, Zimbabwe Online Debate League, 2020 SADC People's Summit Debate Championship 2021, amongst many others. She has been on the core education panel for the Pan African University Debating Championships in 2021, and just like I said, is also set to serve on the CAP for the World University Debating Championship 2022. That's Belgrade, the people that we're partnering with for this specific edition of the program. She's a serial chair judge at outrounds of major tournaments, including Doxbridge Worlds, SANUDC, Warwick IV, WSDC, and of course the WUDC. So without further, I think she's also a very household name. So thank you very much, Noluthando, for taking out time out of a very busy schedule to join us today. We're excited to have you. The floor is all yours.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So I'm going to cover a few things today, and a lot of these things that I'm going to cover are things that are quite intertwined, and because they're so intertwined, it makes it a lot easier for you to be able to understand the logical progression of each one in terms of what you need to think, how you would need to structure your thinking as a judge when it comes to these particular things. And the value of understanding these is probably less on the surface when it comes to how people think about adjudication. And this is largely because we tend to tell adjudicators you need to understand the basics of British parliamentary or world school style, depending on which one you're in. But there's very little emphasis on things like what exactly a motion entails. What does that mean in terms of the way you interact with the motion as a judge listening to people speak, and how you then are able to make your calls based on the understanding of these kinds of requirements as they're set out. As a result, then, I'm going to be doing a few things. The first is I'm going to be looking at motion analysis and how motion analysis as a judge works. Two, I'm going to look at comparative, how most things like motion analysis tie in the comparative analysis that plays out in a particular room, and what happens in instances where it doesn't necessarily fall within the confines of what you will have found as being important within your motion analysis. And then lastly, I'll briefly have a discussion about capping and motion setting, because a lot of this is really just going to link back to the discussion that I'm going to be having in more depth about motion analysis. So at some point during this discussion, I'm very happy to take like questions that you have. I'm going to ask though that with each section that I'm going to be doing of this discussion, you maybe just note down your questions and I'll happily answer them at the end, because it does make it a lot easier for everyone to be able to follow what I'm going to be speaking about. So starting then with motion analysis, there are a few things that are a requirement when it comes to understanding motions. Firstly, you have to understand that motions require teams, speakers, to pick a specific side. So if you're in proposition, you can't be in the middle. If you're in opposition, you can't be in the middle. That's not to say that there's a requirement to take a hard stance for every single argument or every single case you're ever going to make, because soft stances sometimes are functional. But it's simply to say that even in your soft stance, there has to be a particular direction in which the argumentation is going that seeks to suggest that a particular side on whether or not you agree or disagree with the motion has taken place, right? So what that means then is that depending on whatever the motion is, if it is a policy motion, for example, speakers would have to explain why it is that a particular policy is one that they're going for, why they would maintain status quo if they're in the opposition, or at the very least, why it is that their counter proposition would be something that is a lot better than what is suggested by the proposition. That same goes for any other kind of motion, inclusive of normative motions, as to what kind of like analysis would be made in terms of the metrics that we use to value the success of a particular action within a debate, right? So in terms of motion analysis, then, I think the first thing that we want judges to understand is the type of motion that you're going to be dealing with in a particular round. Are you dealing with a motion that requires us to do something that is going to create a particular change, and therefore requires things like motion, requires things like policies that are going to determine how that particular action is going to function, how it's likely to play out within society? Or are we having discussions on a more normative basis where there's some kind of metric that you seek to create value for on the basis of the evaluation that you're making of a particular discussion that's happening within that motion? And the importance of this is that understanding the type of motion that you have means that you understand the more fundamental elements of that are required in terms of technique from speakers. So by technique, I mean whether or not they're able to set out a functional frame under which this particular policy would work, whether or not the metrics by which we measure the value of a particular belief, a particular preference, or a particular reason to support certain things is one that's effectively engaged by a team, all comes down to whether or not you're able to establish what a particular motion in the way that it is set out requires you as a judge to be listening for. Right? So the first thing you want to understand is what type of motion you're going to have people speaking on in that particular round. Secondly, then, it's important to understand the metrics by which you're going to be able to measure such a thing. A lot of the time, these metrics you will be given by the speakers themselves. So you'll find speakers telling you, in order for us to be able to win this debate, we need to be able to prove 1, 2, 3, and 4. A lot of the time, these are just simple measures of what it requires what is required of speakers in order for them to be able to prove a specific case. So, for example, if you were given the motion, this house regrets whatever that would be, it would be a question of what constitutes a regret, to what extent we're able to establish that that regret as a particular team, and what that means in terms of our ability then to establish the value of maintaining such a regret in that instance. So the thing that would follow next would be the metrics by which we value or evaluate the success of a particular case in this instance. Of course, please note, this is not to say that you can be rigid in the way in which you seek to judge a debate, because it does happen in various instances where people misread the motion and so miss out significantly important elements of the debate itself, which means that your motion analysis does not become what the be all and end all of the debate is. It simply becomes something that allows you to be able to understand what would be considered the average intelligent voter's ideals on what the debate ought ultimately look like. What this then means is two things. The first is that as a judge, in terms of motion analysis, you're identifying important elements of the debate that would otherwise play out. However, as a judge, you're not inserting yourself into the debate such that whatever metrics you identify become what you measure the debate by. So what this means is two things. One, the value of your motion analysis is for your understanding of the debate, right? Your understanding of the direction in which the debate, as per the motion, would ordinarily take place. It secondly allows you to be able to understand the grouping of argumentation as argumentation takes place in the debate. Because a lot of the time you'll find that speakers will have relatively similar ideas, potentially different conclusions, potentially different premises under which those ideals are going to be discussed. But a lot of the time, there's some degree of similarity, and you would have to do the necessary analysis to sort of just kind of pull them apart and figure out who places where. Motion analysis also becomes significantly important in the way in which you do this, because there is a degree to which we need to understand whether or not speakers are arguing within the spirit of the motion. This is to say, in instances where a particular team argues outside of the confines of the debate, in a debate where three other teams understood the motion and went with it, motion analysis would be able to assist you in identifying who is likely to be outside of the scope of what the debate ultimately looks like. So remember, rigidity in this instance is not something that you can justify by virtue of saying you've done your motion analysis, because your motion analysis is simply an assisting guideline for you to understand how a motion ultimately functions. Thirdly, then, in terms of motion analysis, you'd probably be looking at what it is that the debate ultimately what questions the debate ultimately looks to answer, right? I said at first that there's the discussion around the metrics by which we measure the success of the cases in these debates. These differ from the kind of questions that I'm talking about now. The questions I speak about now are more content-specific questions. So these are often questions that debaters seek to answer by giving you specific arguments that will speak to that motion. That means two things. The first is they will potentially tell you that this one argument wants to respond to this specific element of the motion. Note that there are instances where motions are multi-layered and have different ideas that need to be responded to in order for you to effectively engage the motion as a whole. It becomes important then to understand what questions as a whole the motion wants speakers to answer in order for them to be successful in winning the round. Of course, similar principle applies here in that you cannot be rigid in the way in which you view the questions that are likely to arise from the motion, because it's quite easy to come up with superficial questions around what a specific motion speaks to, but there's a certain level of depth that often comes in the 15 minutes that people have to put together argumentation. So in those instances, I heard the recording. Okay, cool. That will mean that you would be looking at the content of the argumentation as per the way in which the motion is set up, and thus would be able to effectively engage as an adjudicator, direction of understanding the debate that's happening, while at the same time having a clear sort of direction of where it is the motion is ultimately. This is that motions are set with very specific intentions by CAPs. They have intentions to have specific arguments be made within those rounds. This doesn't always happen. And because this doesn't always happen, we always have to create the necessary leeway to be able to kind of shift away from what the motion ultimately would be, even in the instance where that isn't necessarily to the truest sense of the spirit of the motion. However, the spirit of the motion is some judges in being able to give one, effective feedback in explaining to teams why it is that they may have debated outside of the spirit of the motion. Two, effectively understanding where it is that teams would have the most important things to clash on based on what the motion requires. And lastly, in terms of being able to effectively engage where it is that those clashes fall on the basis of who is most successful in engaging the more important element of the motion in a way that ultimately allows you to be able to win that particular round. So the importance of motion analysis is really just the understanding that judges ought to have. Note then, in instances where you are a judge who has specific specialized knowledge on a particular thing, when I'm talking about metrics earlier, we're not talking about the metrics that would come from someone who has specialized knowledge and has researched specific elements of a particular motion. It is the ideas of a general human being, someone who is of average intelligence, and how they would interact with that motion and what they would find persuasive. Note again, persuasive in this instance is based on the way in which arguments are made by teams and how effective they are in being able to prove the links of those arguments, and not necessarily on the questions of fact, in the sense that you would have a specific understanding of how a particular thing works. So if we're having a science motion and you understand molecules to work in a particular way and an argument is made, that argument has to be valued on the metrics of how it interacted with the debate, as opposed to whether or not you believe it as a person who happens to be a scientist. Not the best example, but definitely something that's going to give you an analogy of how it is that that would work. Secondly, then, in terms of the idea of comparative analysis and how comparative analysis works in this instance, and I think that this definitely is something that needs a lot of listening from adjudicators when it comes to the way speakers make arguments. It's important to understand that the speaking style of different people, and when I say style, I don't mean the way you present yourself in terms of voice, gestures, etc. I mean in terms of the way in which they structure argumentation, the way in which they deliver argumentation on the basis of what they consider to be either comparative or the way they do specific rebuttal or whatever the case may be. That's what I'm referring to in terms of style here. The differences in all of the different speakers have to be accounted for in the way you listen to the debate. Listening to the debate becomes a significantly important element when we get to things like comparative analysis, because it determines whether or not a speaker has been effective in weighing the value of the arguments that they are making, right? So proposition tells you 1, 2, 3, and 4. Opposition is making their own arguments of 1, 2, 3, and 4. These arguments are separate from one another. They aren't necessarily ones that seek to directly contrast one another, but there are elements to which you're able to see a direct sort of engagement between these arguments. It's important in your ability to do the comparatives to show why it is that one argument is sufficient in being able to either show the other argument as being inefficient, or is able to show the other argument as being less comparatively valuable as what the argument that is being made is. So in these instances, what you're looking at the impact of the argument that has been made on an argument that directly contrasts that one, and how you're able to effectively show whether or not one or the other team wins that particular clash. Of course, this differs based on the debate and how the debate takes place, because there are certain instances where it's not going to be argument versus argument, but it's going to be line of argumentation as it relates to a particular issue versus line of argumentation as it relates to a particular issue. So in those instances, the comparison that you want to make is a comparison that questions whether or not speakers have been effective in showing the importance of their argumentation in comparison to the argument that they seek to respond to. Have they been effective? One, in responding to the argument, its reasoning, and every other element of that argument that has been made. Two, the extent of the argument that is made to respond, has it done a good enough job in being able to establish a significant amount of doubt in a way that is going to ensure that the argument that they are making is superior to that which has already been made? Note, superiority is not based on whether or not you believe it. It is based on whether or not the way the argument is made is effective in showing that there is, in fact, a significant lack on the side of the argument that sought to initially set up whatever it is that is being made. Even in the instance where we're talking about the initial argument being better than the responsive argument, it would still be the same type of metric that you would use to then do the comparative analysis. You want to be able, as a judge, to identify arguments, firstly. Secondly, you also want to be able to identify arguments that interact with one another within a debate. Because there are instances where debaters are not going to outright tell you that, look, I'm now responding to argument A that was made by speaker A in team A. In those instances, it requires you to then note-taking one, firstly. It requires you to do effective note-taking that is going to allow you to be able to track the debate properly. Secondly, it requires you to be able to look at what directly contrasts one another in such a way that you would have to do those kinds of comparatives. And it would also then require you to be able to look at the basis of what argumentation ultimately becomes. What does an argument look like? How does a fully established argument maintain its value in instances where it is challenged? How does it lose its value in instances where it is challenged? How do we evaluate the conclusions of particular arguments based on the premises that are used to prove it, and whether or not those contrasting arguments then are ultimately more valuable on one side or the other? This is a complex process, but it's also a relatively simple process because speakers tend to make it simple for you in two ways. The first, they tell you what the argument is. They tell you what the argument seeks to prove. They tell you how they go about proving that argument by actually making the argument, right? So tracking the argument, understanding the argument is the first way in which you're able to start your comparative analysis, because that's where you're going to be able to compare a team versus a team, an argument versus an argument. Secondly, once you've been able to do all of the identification metrics that I'm talking about here, you then have to do the exact same thing on the opposite side, right? What's the argument? What does it seek to prove? What has happened in proving that argument? And have they been effective in doing so? If they have, you have two arguments, one versus the other. You now have to measure both arguments against one another. Measure both arguments against one another. And the way in which you go about doing this is through looking at things like, when you compare the two arguments, which of the two is able to establish an impact that is valuable enough on the basis of what the motion requires, as well as on the basis of what the debate that is taking place requires. So if we're having a debate about allowing prisoners to vote, proposition says we care about representation, such that that representation has to happen even in the instance where we're talking about people who have been incarcerated on the basis of not following the country's laws. Opposition says we think that the laws of a state ought to be ones that we protect, and the way in which we create that protection is through creating a precedent that the way we interact with people who don't have a regard for the law is that they don't have a direct impact on how such laws are either implemented, come up with, whatever the case may be. The comparative is not going to, of course, these arguments are a lot better when they're made in actual argumentation. This is just me giving you an example. You would then have to do the analysis to show what the impact of the response is to the original argument, and to what extent the original argument still stands by the time the response is made. And if the original argument does not have a significant impact, you would then look at whether or not the opposition argument would have been effective in at least showing why it is that there's some value to the side that they're talking about. And in that instance, then you would call it on the basis of those particular questions. The value of comparative analysis is that it allows you as a judge, one, in your feedback, to be able to establish why it is that one team is able to prove a specific thing over another. Secondly, it's able to establish why it is that you were able to be swayed in a particular direction on the basis of a particular issue. The importance of this is that it makes, one, your oral adjudication a lot better in being able to assist speakers to understand where they've gone wrong. But two, it makes it a lot easier for you to make a call on a particular debate, because you're able to establish why it is that a particular issue goes to a particular team, and why it is that any other team subsequently would fall under that team on the basis of that issue. Because there's 4 teams in the room, chances are they're going to speak about a single issue at some point, and those clashing ideas on the single issue would need you to do the necessary dissection in order for you to effectively engage in a particular instance. And because comparative analysis is so important, we often tell speakers to do comparative analysis within their argumentation. You cannot take what speakers tell you is comparative analysis as being the be-all and end-all of your argumentation, unless when you do your comparative of the argumentation that is made in the debate, it falls on a similar weighting as what the speakers would have. So because speakers say comparatively we're better, it doesn't mean comparatively they're better. It just simply means that they want you to believe that they're better. In order for you to establish whether or not they're better, you would have to measure and weigh the value of the argument that they make to establish that being better in those instances. Cool. Lastly, then, in terms of the idea of capping and motion setting, and I think this is good to go back quite a bit to the motion analysis discussion, because quite a bit of motion analysis has to go into motion setting when you are on cap for a particular tournament. Starting then capping, there are quite a number of things that happen when you end up on a cap for a particular tournament. This includes motion setting. It includes the running of the tournament as it relates to things like ensuring that you have the right judges in the right rooms, ensuring that you're able to pack your panels in a way that is going to ensure that you have the very best all round for all the rooms that you're going to be running that room in, and looking at things like feedback that comes from speakers as it relates to particular chairs, being able to move them around as a result of that. It goes to things like adjudication tests, briefings, all of the elements that you see CAP members having to partake in, having to partake in instances where we in instances where those CAP members would be running a tournament. So in terms of CAP then, the first thing that you need to understand as a CAP member is that there's a significant amount of, excuse me, I'm injured, so it's quite a bit of a situation. There's a significant amount of responsibility that comes with it, that speaks to, one, your work ethic and integrity, and two, in terms of speaking to whether or not you're effectively able to ensure the running of a tournament is going to be effective. So one, you have to understand it takes quite a bit of time, in that you would have to do things like compile judge tests, mark those judge tests, score people accordingly in order for you to be able to determine who would be chair, who would be panel, who would be weaker panel, and who would potentially end up being a trainee. All of these things have to happen at an objective level. So you cannot, because you're friends with someone, decide, oh, I'm going to make you chair because you're my bestie. It doesn't work like that. They have to actually prove themselves as being worthy of having that title, which means you would have to look at things like CVs. You would have to look at things like what their test scores look like, and therefore be able to establish those things. Two, you need to understand how setting panels works. So what makes someone a chair? What makes someone a strong panelist? How do you pair a particular chair with a particular panelist, and what does that mean? So, for example, an extremely strong chair who also has an extremely strong personality and has the potential to strong arm a panel is probably going to be someone that you need to panel with people who have the ability to maintain in instances where they need to, and also have the capacity to understand that they can be swayed in a deliberation. But that, of course, is something that needs you to be able to read feedback from judges on judges. You have to read feedback from speakers. All of these things go into the element of CAP. Thirdly, in terms of the running of the tournament, there are also going to be things like doing motion clarifications and various other elements that come into play when you're going to be capping a tournament. So the running of the tournament places ADJCORs, CAPs rather, in a position where they have to be at the fore of ensuring that there's a smooth running of the tournament, and ultimately allow for people to be able to get the best experience possible when it comes to tournaments. A very important element of that then is motion setting. Motions, unfortunately, are not just sentences or statements that you give and expect people to talk about yes or no, whether or not they agree to them. There's an element of technicality that goes into them that requires you to do all of the things that are in it, because that's going to determine whether or not a motion is successful in being able to, one, not be weighted, and two, have enough depth for the running of that particular round. So an idea is not always going to formulate into a motion, and that's the first thing as someone who seeks to be on a CAP you need to understand. You may have a brilliant idea, but all that it is a conversation on the couch with your friends, but cannot really be formulated into something that would ultimately make for a good debate. A good motion or a good debate is one that can be argued on both sides to a relatively equal depth, such that a middle room in a tournament can do a relatively good job in being able to run that round, but a room at the bottom of the tab would still be able to effectively engage to some degree, such that they have an engaging debate, right? So in terms of weighting then, you would have to understand what the more superficial argumentation on one side looks like, what it looks like on the other side, whether or not when compared to one to the other, you would be able to have an effective debate, or whether one side would superficially be stronger. Note, I use the term superficially quite loosely because there are instances where a motion does require you to do a little bit more and dig a little bit deeper as a speaker in order for you to be able to create argumentation. But for the most part, when doing your motion creation, you're trying to create motions that can be argued at the bottom room, can be argued in the middle room, and can be argued in the top room of a particular tournament. Of course, there's elements to which we have to look at things like the depth of a motion. So a motion can be a good one that has weighting such that both sides can argue, but might not be a BP styled motion because it doesn't allow you to be able to really have an engaging back half in a middle room, for example. And that means that that debate would arguably be a motion that would happen better at World Schools because you have 3 versus 3, or at AP where you have 3 versus 3, as opposed to a motion for 4 teams of 2 in a room, as would happen in a BP situation. In those instances, then, the kind of measurements that you have would be to stress test your motion. Stress testing looks at things like, is your motion effective in being able to create the kind of argumentation that is going to exist on both sides such that it can compete, right? If arguments are made well enough that either side could win the debate. 2, is the motion such that if the opening half is at least good enough to do what is required from an opening half, would the closing half be able to extend on the motion that you're bringing forth? And if they would be able to extend, would those extensions function to be able to place them in a position where they could either win on analytical extension or they could win on a substantive extension? That determines the success of a motion in being able to weigh its value. Of course, there are other elements that go into this. Things like understanding equity and how equity functions, and how it is that you're very likely, when setting particular motions, going to be standing on controversial ground, and to what extent you would want to then push the boundaries of controversy. Of course, these are also things that would have to come into play when having discussions about setting particular motions, right? And there's definite value in looking at that. Once you have a set of motions, you want to make sure that in terms of theme, you have a diverse number of motions, unless you have a specific type of debating tournament that you're going to. So if we're doing a law tournament, it's very likely that you're going to have law-related motions, and that's fine. If you're doing an environmental tournament, environment-related, all these things are going to be what comes in. But if it is a general open tournament, or world schools, world universities, whatever type of tournament it is, that it's an open and general tournament, you would want to have a diversity of motion themes that would ultimately allow you to be able to test debaters on the entire spectrum of themes that we potentially come up with. Secondly, then, in terms of motion setting, rounds have specific styles of motions that you can use. The first round of a tournament, most people are quite rusty as speakers when they're entering into these tournaments. Unless they've been speaking regularly, this is not something that you would expect. You would not necessarily expect everyone to be at their peak at round 1. So the round 1 motion, and I think this is something that has become quite common practice. It's not necessarily the way in which it's done in all tournaments, but it is quite common practice that the first round tournament would be one that is somewhat easily accessible, one that would make such that most people in the tournament, even the novice speakers, have the ability to access it and be able to debate it to some degree. Motion 2 would be around a similar kind of thinking as the first motion, maybe with a little bit more of a twist in terms of being able to establish a little bit of intensity in terms of difficulty here, but it wouldn't necessarily be something that is over the top. Motion 3 would be where you have some degree, and this is me thinking about a 5-round tournament, please note. Motion 3 would probably be where you're starting to test speakers on specific things. This is where you're very likely going to find that it would probably look like an IR motion, probably look like an economics motion, because here we're starting to get to stronger power pairing in terms of the rooms that we're seeing, and we're also starting to create a lot more of a larger competitive type of vibe in the tournament itself. The motion in round 3 tends to be slightly on the more technical end, a little bit more on the end that is more competitive in terms of the way in which it requires speakers to interact with it. Round 4 would have a similar approach, not necessarily be one that is extreme in its nature, but it would also probably move towards sides that are less general, have a little bit of a more specialized feel to it. IR, economics, politics, something very specific in the way in which it interacts with the debate itself. And then with round 5, because it is either 1 likely to be a closed round, but 2 also likely to be the round where dead rooms are clear, live rooms are clear, breaking rooms are also quite clear. This is the round where we want everyone to be able to access a fair shot and being able to access the break if you are in a live room. And so it would be a relatively accessible motion, not the same as what would happen in round 1, but quite similar to having a middle ground between your round 3 and your round 2, potentially looking like something that would happen in a round 4. So all of this are things that you want to take into consideration when you are capping a particular tournament, because you want to ensure that the way you're setting motions is ultimately going to allow you to effectively ensure that whoever's going to be in the tournament has a fair shot at breaking, a fair shot post the break to try and win that particular tournament. And so in terms of motion setting, you want to look at depth of the motion, you want to look at weighting of a motion, you want to look at the diversity of the motions that you're going to be setting, depending on the type of debating tournament that you have. You want to look at the way in which you're setting them in particular rounds and how that plays out. And that will help you determine how it is that you structure your motion setting as CAP members in a given tournament. And that pretty much sums up the content element of this conversation. And at this point, I would be super happy to take any questions. You can just unmute, ask your question, or is that how you're doing it, Eze? I'm not sure.
Yeah, sure. Everything that approach is different. So guys, if you have questions, okay, so somebody's hand is up.
I see Joyce has a question.
So my question is, when set in motion, sometimes some, can you hear me? Oh, so sometimes you find that some motions are leaning towards one side. For instance, maybe a motion is towards the opposition. So in as much as the proposition is trying their best, most likely the opposition, it's favoring the opposition. So does that determine how you're going to judge that debate? Also, there are some motions that are totally against maybe someone's beliefs and thoughts, and sometimes some judges are biased, like they're already biased when that motion comes. How do you keep yourself away from being swayed by such?
Cool. So I also saw that there was a question in the chat box about the difference between substantive and analytical extensions. I'll have that chat in a second. I'm just going to start with the 2 questions that have been asked. In terms of weighted motions, we try by all means, and I think this is something that I can speak for everyone who's ever been on a CAP. We try by all means to make sure that motions are not weighted. That at the very least, each side is able to make an argument. But there are instances where personal biases, or even that the motion itself finds itself being weighted and really does somehow pop past the scrutiny that is put on motions. And in instances like this, it does become somewhat difficult to find a middle ground when it comes to weighted motions, specifically because you aren't supposed to have a specific side to which you're swaying as a judge. But one of the things that I would often say is that you have to measure your own bias as a person and then understand how that bias affects your ability to be swayed. So, and note, this is not something that is very easy to do, because understanding yourself as an individual ultimately is going to determine whether or not you're able to effectively engage your own bias. To the extent where there's a middle ground where the motion exists and your bias is on a particular side, you have to measure the extent to which you are swayed in the other direction in order for you to be able to engage whether or not a team is successful in being able, at the very least, to establish effective argumentation beyond your bias. Because I think it's hard not to have a bias, but it's important to be aware of your bias, such that your bias doesn't affect the debate. Because the first thing that we'll always tell you is that do not insert yourself as a judge into the debate. You cannot, as a judge, decide that because you're feeling a particular way about a debate, it can only go one way or the other. Always going to be in the implementation of the argumentation by speakers. And so in certain instances, you'll find that it is a little bit difficult to be able to deal with weighting. It is a little bit difficult to deal with bias, but understanding that you have that bias is very important, and to measuring the extent to which you've been swayed away from that bias when you're doing your comparative analysis is a way to assist yourself in being able to push that. There's a little bit more sort of detail in relation to this in the manual, in the WUDC manual, as to how you deal with weighted motions. And that helps you on a more technical level to set up a clear sort of guideline as to how you do that. But what I'm basically giving to you now is just how you set up a skill set in understanding your own biases in these instances. Then in terms of substantive and analytical extensions, these differ in two ways. An analytical extension, well, not in one actually, an analytical extension is an extension of arguments already made within the debate that seeks to extend, one, the scope of the argument, two, the premises which have been used to establish that particular argument, or three, the extent to which the impact of the argument has taken place. Right? So I'm taking an already existing argument, I'm showing it to have more impact, or I'm establishing it better than what was done before. And this is not in terms of language, it's simply in terms of the extent to which you're able to prove the argument, or I'm extending the scope and reach of that particular argument as a speaker. And that makes up an analytical extension. Of course, when you're measuring analytical extensions, you're measuring them on the basis of how much more effective they are from the original set argument that is a precursor to the analytical extension. Substantive extensions are extensions of completely new matter, of completely new matter that comes into the debate in the second stages of, in the second half of the debate. So substantive is new matter, analytical is matter based on the arguments that have already been made, but seeks to create newer impacts, greater scope, or even just establish more important premises for a particular argument that's already been made. Ritabile?
Thank you, Nolu, for these gems. I just wanted to ask, so you have two, because I'm asking from a point of a speaker, I'm trying to get the insight. So you have two arguments that come in, and both substantiate and they do the work that they need to do. So let's say it's just it's a good debate room. Please just what then is the final I don't know if it's an extension or what is that thing that you then have to go back into, especially when you adjudicate, that then distinguishes you and brings the debate home. Because I find that sometimes you can have this, like you have arguments, it's just I don't know if I'm making sense, but there's existence of arguments, there's points, everything is there. But then there's always something that's missing that then just ranks you. If you can just let me know what that final is, that thing is, and also just please touch a bit on framing, as well as how adjudicator looks at the framing when you bring the debate. Thank you.
Cool. So it's a little bit difficult to answer that question, the first question that is, and this is because the way in which argumentation is made in debate often is determined by the way a specific debate takes place. So what is missing from a particular speech is mostly going to be something that is contextual to the debate that you're watching and the debate that you're listening to. But of course, there are very specific basics that are required from speakers in order for an argument to be effective. They need to be able to show us specific elements of an argument that are often taught in different ways. Some people will call it claim, warrant, impact. Others refer to it as a point, reasons, examples, or evidence, and link back to the motion. All of those things still need to take place in order for you to be able to make an effective argument. But of course, the way the argument is made, the way the argument is closed, the way the argument is measured and weighed against already existing arguments within the debate is going to determine whether or not a particular argument is the most effective in the debate. So it's really hard to say what would tip you over in a particular debate unless we were talking about a specific debate. Unfortunately, then it makes it a little bit difficult. In terms of framing, then, note, framing is important. It's important to understand what the debate is about, what exactly it is that you're trying to go for, how it is that you got to that on the basis of things like context, etc. However, this is not what wins a debate. It does a significant job in creating a direction for how you could potentially win the debate, and the way in which a particular frame is set out, accepted, or even attacked by another team is also a significant determiner of whether or not a debate is successful. However, frames are exactly that. They set up a clear sort of metric by which we measure the debate. They set up a clear understanding of what the direction of the debate should look like. But unless speakers and teams follow through in argumentation to establish the value of that framing, the framing on its own cannot win you a debate. The value of framing is in establishing metrics. The value of framing is mostly going to further be established in the instance where that framing has the follow through that is needed in the form of the argumentation that is being made. Framing and argumentation differ quite a bit because argumentation speaks to the content of the motion itself to the extent where you're able to prove the value of the side that you're on. Framing seeks to establish where, how, why, when a particular thing is happening and why it is that it has to happen on the basis of a particular sort of action that is being undertaken. And sometimes it may even be on the basis of which metrics we're going to be using to measure the value of a particular principle or existence within society. The next name I see is Shibra. I'm so sorry, I might not say that correctly. Someone say something?
Yeah, sorry to just, I think what you mentioned is just so important because even at times when I adjudicate, the difference between framing and argumentation, and I think that's also something that is so pivotal. You just went through it, but please just go for the last time where you identify that this is the framing and this is argumentation, because they may be similar, but you do mention that there's quite a difference within that spectrum. Please just touch on it the last time.
All right, sure. So what I was saying is that framing and argumentation are a little bit different, right? I mean, they correlate quite well. It's very important to have both, but framing seeks to set up the metrics by which we measure the success of an argument. So those would be things like setting up context, having us understand why this debate is happening, how it is that it's happening, in which world you're setting it up, what that looks like, why there's value in it, and all of those things. The content of argumentation speaks to the more content-related questions of the motion. So here, you're speaking to what the justification for whatever it is that you're saying or doing is, to what extent we value that justification, and it speaks directly to the content and core of the motion itself, as opposed to setting up what world that would function within and why that world looks the way that it does. Is that clear?
Yes, thank you.
Cool. Shibra, I hope I'm saying that correctly.
Yes, right, Shibra. Thank you very much for this training. I've at one point been in a situation where I'm judging a particular debate, and the two teams, proposition and opposition, almost do not disagree on anything as a result of misinterpretation of the resolution. So I was wondering, in such a scenario, what is the adjudicator tasked to do? What side is supposed to be penalized and
okay, so in instances where you find yourself in a situation where there's just like a strange agreement that's happening on both sides, it goes back to the initial discussion that we were having about motion analysis. Here, you should be able to establish which side of the motion each team is supposed to be on, right? And so that on its own should be able to give you some degree of leeway to establish whether or not one side has at least tried to get to somewhat of a fulfillment of the requirement of their side. So if the two teams are agreeing, one team is wrong. If the two teams are agreeing, one team in the room is arguing the wrong side of the debate. And you need to establish, using motion analysis, which team is arguing on the wrong side, and that's how you're going to be able to call that particular round. I hope that's clear. Or at least it allows for an understanding for that particular scenario.
Okay, then the very last one. What happens if team proposition gives, okay, how can I put this? They misinterpret the resolution, and team opposition just debates that. Are you supposed to penalize team proposition for misinterpreting the resolution, or opposition for not, I don't know, identifying that?
So you judge the debate as it is, right? If there's a misinterpretation of the motion on both sides and both teams go with it, you judge the debate that takes place in the room. And what makes one side more effective than the other becomes their ability to prove the debate that they're having on the metrics that they would have set. Because the difficulty in trying to figure out how to penalize both sides, I mean, this will happen in speaker scores because you would have to look at things like whether or not they were relevant to the motion, whether or not the arguments were relevant when you're looking at the scale that you would be given for that particular, the world speaker scale. But in terms of awarding the debate, you would judge the debate as it is, as it happens in the room. Are there any more questions?
Yeah, no, there's a question in the chat by Perez. The last question, I think you have responded.
Sure, do you mind reading that to me?
Okay, it says, so in those debates where a team takes a middle stance, like they leave it open, and another team takes a hard stance, is there something like prioritizing the one who took a hard stance as compared to the team who took a middle stance. I guess that means soft stance. While adjudicating.
Okay. Cool. So soft stances and hard stances can't be determined on a relevant on just any basis, right? They have to be based on what the motion requires in and of itself. Because there are times when a soft stance is just more strategic based on which side of the debate that you're on, and is effective in taking down a hard stance. So there's no real science as to how you engage those, specifically in instances where both teams have taken a side but have opted to argue it in a particular way. So it would still come down to how the debate takes place, who's effective in proving their side and who's not. Prince Daniel here. Please unmute. I see your hand. Did we lose Prince? Looks like we have. Are there any other questions? If there aren't any other questions, Eze, I think I am done for today.
All right. I think we lost Prince there. Probably trying to join back. But anyways, thank you very much, Nolu, for affording us your time for today. I think that was quite a very comprehensive package that you delivered there. Hi everyone. So don't also forget, I'm going to put the attendance form immediately right after now. So do not be in a hurry to leave. But I think we can excuse Nolu. If you have further questions for her, probably could channel that and then put it on the WhatsApp platform as well. Thank you very much, and good luck with WUDC next month.
Thanks, everyone.